Buddy. It's Monday. It's 1 o'clock, so looks like it's time for Pirkei Avot by Steer and Ashkafa. This week's going to be a little bit more. Well, a little bit. I think it's going to be a bit of both. Um, Excuse me. I hope everybody's okay. I hope your Yom Ha'atzmaut was enjoyable. It's going to be a quiet time for a while from a calendrical point of view. Although here in Israel, we're in the middle of what's called the Chamsin. It's really, really hot. So I hope I hope you're settling in the air conditioning if you're living in Israel. And we are moving on to a new Mishnah. The next Mishnah in the first parak, in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, goes as follows. Excuse me. Shimon Beno. This is chapter 1, number 17. Shimon Beno Omer, Kol Yamai Gadalti Ben Chachamim, V'lo Matzati Laguf Tov Mishtika. His son Shimon, the previous Mishnah had been attributed to Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel was the head of the Pharisees, the head of the Torah Shabbat Peh party in Israel, in Jerusalem, in the era before in one generation before the destruction of the temple. According to Paul of Tarsus, he was his teacher. He was the grandson of Hillel, and he died about, I guess, 10, 15 years before the destruction of the temple, 55, 60, so on and so forth. And his son Shimon took his place. He's mentioned as a very nice person, by the way, by Josephus and others. And he says, my entire life I grew up among sages, which fits that MO, right, that bio. V'lo matzati laguf tov mishtika. And the best thing I found, the thing that I found the most salutary thing that I could find is silence. It's being quiet. V'lo midrash ikar el hamaaseh. And even though that might be true, teaching theoretically things, theoretical teaching is inferior to action. V'cholam rabeh dvarim may be chet. And if you talk too much, you're going to talking too much leads to sin. Obviously, the three are going to integrate. We'll see that probably next week. But I want to concentrate, and that's what I told Rabbi Constantine that I want to emphasize this week. I want to talk about this idea of lo matzati laguf tov mishtika. I found silence is golden, which raises the question of the attitude of the Jewish attitude towards language, towards words, towards speech, towards the use of speech and the abuse of speech, and so on. It's interesting. There is a very, I think, conflicted attitude towards speech and the way that we relate to speech in our daily lives, irrespective of, the truth is, irrespective of formal halacha. Speech is a funny thing. Language, words, are kind of odd. Why are they odd? Because on the one hand, in a very profound sense, we view language as incredibly important, incredibly holy. Truth is, at the end of the day, God communicates with us from or via the Word. The Word, God's words, bridge the chasm between the dimension in which He is found and us. God's language is what created the world. Bidvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu. The world was created by, let there be light and all this other stuff. Language is very, very important. Language has almost divine qualities. In fact, when the Torah describes the creation of man and says, excuse me, Vayi Adam lenefesh chaya, that man became a living being, imbued in the image of God, created in the image of God. The Aramaic translation of the Torah defines the words, or translates the words nefesh chaya, a living being, leruach memalala, a soul, having a spirit that speaks. Now, I'm not talking about people who live to speak. A lot of people like that. In fact, I talked a lot about the abuse of language in my Parshat Shavua shir that I distribute for my Facebook page and Instagram page and on YU Torah, so you can check that out. My discussion, my brief discussion of Parshat Tazria Torah from last week. But but it's not just about people who live to speak or abuse speech. Rather, meaning that man's wisdom, man's intellect, a person's being created in the image of God, is expressed or is marked by the fact that he is endowed with the gift of speech. Now, that doesn't mean that man is the only being who can communicate. That's ridiculous. It's obvious, and it's become even increasingly obvious that animals know how to communicate with each other. Higher animals that are higher up on the evolutionary chain have even more and more sophisticated speech. Now however, that doesn't. People use that to beat up humans. Say, well, what are humans? Chimpanzees also know how to speak. They don't know how to speak this on the same level. So you can have, just because very few things are binary in that regard. You can be at the top and have reached a level of achievement as a species without saying, well, everything else has to be of no value. But in any case, the ability to be able to speak is, in fact, traditionally, starting with the statement by the Aramaic translation of the Torah, and all the way through medieval Jewish philosophy, the ability to speak, or the use of speech, is supposed to be an indication of one's being created in the image of God and one's having an intellect. One of the faculties which is invoked in medieval Jewish philosophy consistently as evidence of the intelligence of people, of human beings, is the fact that they know how to speak. Of course, you could argue, and I have more than once felt that, okay, that's all very well and good, but so many people say so many stupid things. One wonders whether speech is really by definition an indication of intelligence. But to put it more seriously, just because there is something good doesn't mean it can't be misused, and that's what we're going to talk about. If intelligence is indicated by speech and the ability to be able to conceptualize in words, and that ultimately leads to writing, and that ultimately leads to sophisticated conceptual thought, and all of that emerges from the ability to speak. Why was it that Shimon ben Gamliel, or Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, said that I see nothing better than speech, than silence. Nothing is better than silence. That would seem to be mutually contradictory. I mean, how does that work? Why is that? One could argue, one could suggest, and this is not what the commentaries actually argue, one could suggest that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel here is saying that there are both limits and parameters and hesitations that adhere to speech. For example, speech may be divine. Speech may be a unique gift given by God, which is vouchsafed only to human beings. And nevertheless, just as human intelligence is limited, so is human speech limited. I have mentioned on many occasions, not necessarily here, but very, very frequently, that language does reach places, just as human intelligence and human cognition and the human ability to be able to think reach limits when you get to things which are just beyond us. There are things that transcend our ability to express them or our ability to come to comprehend them. We can't comprehend, for example, really a light year. The distances are far too vast. We have difficulty. There are certain emotions that we have difficulty. We are incapable of fully expressing. Our most profound um, emotions cannot be fully expressed in words because language collapses when it comes to them. Love, for example, if you take a look at the literature, the world literature of love poetry or love poetries, for example, you see that that love poems inevitably contain expressions of frustration at the inability of the writer to fully express or make the other person, the object of their love, understand or appreciate or intuit that which they are feeling because language is simply not up to the task, even though it's the height of human intelligence. So it's a there's a mix here. It cuts both ways. Um, there is actually an indicate when it comes to God, and when it comes to things that are very, very sublime and things that are very, very significant, the Torah itself or Halacha itself acknowledges the fact that there are limits to language. So, for example, there's a famous story in the Gemara and Brachas that before the prayer book, before the liturgy was more or less canonized. The liturgy has never been totally canonized, but the general forms are pretty common to all of the various traditions, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, Yemenite, within variations within all of the various different Jewish communities and traditions. That there was an element of improvisation which was expected from the person, especially the person who was the Chazan. And so the Talmud tells a story of a student who was in the Beit Midrash of somebody, and he decided he wants to really praise God. So he starts Elokeinu v'Elo. He's the opening blessing of the Shmona Esrei. The Elokeinu v'Elo Kateinu. Kel Gadol Gibor Banara Kel Elyon V'Harachum V'Chanun Erech Apayim V'Chesed V'Emet. All of the various your long. Aside from what we said, what is constantly said. What is standardly said, he added all kinds of praises. And after about 20 minutes of this, his teacher said, "No, that's all you have to say about God? That's it?" Obviously not, because God is infinite. So the language is infinite. So in other words, trying or make the very attempt to praise God and to try to sort of focus or certainly to do justice to the praises due to God, it's a fool's errand. It can't be done. So he said, and in fact, so this rabbi says to his student, and he says, you know what? If it weren't for the fact that there are specific phrases in revealed literature that we use, we wouldn't be able to say anything because language breaks down. There are as sublime and as divinely rooted as language is, there are limits. So that's being the case. You understand why Shimon ben Gamliel would say, you know what? I found out. I'm very, very conscious. Even my awareness of the importance and of the value of language. Nevertheless, I am very much aware of its limits, and therefore I prefer silence to speech because I recognize the limitations of language. So that's one way of looking at this Mishnah. Interestingly, and here I actually would like to indulge. I hope you'll indulge me with this. I'd like to share with you. Usually, I pull together all kinds of different commentaries, and we talk about historical events. This time, I would like to share with you a famous passage from Maimonides' commentary on the Mishnah, in which he takes the opportunity of discussing this Mishnah to discuss the proper and improper uses of language. Before doing that, however, and I will put up the text. I don't have the text in Hebrew. In English. I'm sorry, but I will put up the text in Hebrew, both on my Facebook page, on my official page, Rabbi Professor Jeffrey Wolf, and obviously on Tel Aviv International Synagogue page. And I'll put it in the first comment. I'd like to just mention in terms of certain expressions of respect that Judaism has, or Jewish practice has towards, out of respect for language. I mean, I'm always going to talk about use and misuse of language, especially of Hebrew, but I'd like to call your attention to the fact that we live in a world in which language is abused, language is subject to tremendous disrespect, language is cheap, and language is dragged through the mud. The fact that, especially in English, profanity is considered to be just, that's freedom. That is the opposite of the Jewish view. Because the world was created with language, because God's word was responsible for creating the word, creating the world, because God's will was revealed to us through the word. What do we do when we learn Torah? We study language. So Jews have always had a tremendous respect for language. Jews don't swear. Hebrew is a language of incredible, of the extensive use of euphemism. The Talmud at the beginning of Tractate Psachim, those of you who do Daf Yomi maybe remember this, point out that in the beginning of the Torah went out of its way to say that Noah should bring animals which are not pure, which are not tahor, as opposed to saying behemat tmeya, in order not to say something which had a negative implication. Maimonides says that one of the ways that you see the beauty and the sanctity of Hebrew is the fact that there are no technical words in Hebrew for the sexual organs. Everything is done. There's no word for sex. There's no F word in Hebrew. There is no direct word for sex. It's all a euphemism. In Hebrew to this day, we don't even mention, up until recently, you never said in Hebrew the word for cancer. You said machala kasha, longing illness, a serious illness. Everybody knew. Because you don't use this extension, this expression of something divine for something negative or profane. And to this day, Hebrew is a very, very understated, religion. Hebrew is a very language. If you want to say something's a disaster, you don't say ason, which is the technical word. You say matzav kashe. It's a difficult time. You say the word kashe, the sky is falling. So as not to abuse language. Similarly, in that same passage in the tractate Tractate Psachim, in the first couple of dapim, first couple of pages, one of the central statements there is, you should always try to pack in the maximum amount of meaning, and people should learn things pithily so as not to overuse language, because you respect the power of words to mean many, many different things. Okay. So Maimonides, against this sort of reverence for language, reverence for words, especially for Hebrew, which is God's language. There's even a medieval, what shall we call it? Not truism, a medieval conceit that there's only one language. The only language in the world is Hebrew. And all other languages are simply corrupted forms of Hebrew, which is an interesting concept, an interesting issue with Jewish self-image. But anyways, so Maimonides, when he comes to this question of why is silence better, he says as follows, and I'm going to just read you the highlights from this. He says, in our Torah, he says, the way that we relate to speech can be divided into 5 categories. Okay. The first is the use of speech for fulfilling God's will. That's the highest. That's the most important. For example, reading the Torah, studying, thinking. Thinking is a very big part of the Talmud Torah. We don't just walk around memorizing books. Prayer. That is the most sublime. Those are the most sublime, and they're not wrote, by the way. I mean, so prayer has become has a fixed text now, and so does the Torah per se. But speech, speaking, discussing Torah topics and things that relate thereto, that's open. That's free use of speech. But nevertheless, even though it's not dictated, and you have a certain responsibility, you have a tremendous responsibility how you use it, how you express yourself. Nevertheless, nevertheless, that's the highest form of use of speech. That's a godly way of speaking. Interestingly, there is this concept, which is not it's not uniquely Jewish, but something called a Tanit Dibur. That everybody knows what a Tanit. Tanit is a fast. On a fast day, you deprive your body of sustenance in order to cleanse yourself, in order to afflict yourself, in order to sensitize yourself. It's all kinds of reasons. There's also a thing called a Tanit Dibur, that you don't speak for a day, 2 days, 10 days, whatever it is. A Tanit Dibur, the only thing you're allowed to say the only time you're allowed to use your voice or your words on a Tanit Dibur is for this first category of purposes: prayer, study, and things of that sort, because it's precisely to try to upgrade your sensitivity to and the purity of the way you use speech, which is a holy thing, that you undertake the fast in the first place. I did it a couple of times as part of various retreats when I was younger. Truth of the matter is, there is something very uplifting about it. And in fact, one of the things you de facto end up doing on Yom Kippur, if you're in shul all day, is the fact you're in a Tanit Dibur. If you don't speak during the service and all you do is daven, you're in a de facto Tanit Dibur, without a vow, without whatever. And if you come out, I think, in my personal experience, is one of the reasons I walk out of Yom Kippur feeling so elevated is not just the all-encompassing warmth and inspiration that's engendered by the day, but by the virtue of the fact that, everything I said was Divrei Kedusha. That's a very unique and very, very enlightening practice. As I said, there are other you find this in other religions. You have entire monastic orders that cultivate silence. In fact, those of us who live in Israel, across the road from the fort at Latrun is the monastery of the brothers of Latrun, and they are silent. It's called Minzara Shatkanim, the monastery of those who are silent, because they don't talk, or they're allowed to talk once every some period of time. And you find it in other religions as well. So this is not just uniquely Jewish, but in the context of this attitude towards language and towards the use and abuse of this divine capacity of speech, then and also we're speaking about Hebrew, that sort of puts it on with steroids. This becomes even more significant. It has an essential impact, which perhaps is not true elsewhere. Okay, so that's number one. Section number two says, Maimonides, there are types of speech which are prohibited. It's not just because, what are they? He says, for example, like lying, perjuring yourself, gossip, tale-bearing, cursing. Not only because you hurt other people. That's enough, but that's not the only reason. You defile language which you were given by God, and you hurt yourself as well. And self-harm is also prohibited. You're not allowed to a person's not allowed to make themselves stupid if God made them smart or gave them the potential for being smart. If you swear and curse, that harms you. You're defiling yourself, not just the other people who feel like they want to take a shower afterwards. Never mind if you gossip or you're talebearer or stuff like that. That would things that are sacred can be defiled. You're given something that's sacred, and you're defiled. If you are impure, for example, if you're tamei, you walk into the Beit HaMikdash, you have defiled the Beit HaMikdash. Aside from being defiled yourself and violating and being harming yourself spiritually by doing them. And in fact, part 1 and part 2, according to Maimonides, are clearly both sides of two sides of the same coin. What's number 3? Interestingly, so first you have really good speech, and then you have really bad speech. So obviously, when it comes to really bad speech, you should have silence. If you have good speech, you should be you should talk as much as possible. So then Maimonides says, but that's really not what you do all day long. People don't sit there and they don't perjure themselves all day long, and they don't lie all day long, and so on. And you don't daven all day long. You don't learn all day long. Most people live in the world of just the day to day. So here Maimonides says, it's interesting. He says, part 3, hu hadavar hama'us, something that's just really, he calls it disgusting. Like, it's really striking. What is that davar hama'us? What is the type of speech which is really revolting, he said? V'hu hadibur asher ein to'elet bo la'adam benafsho v'lo mishma'at v'lo meri. Kirov sipurei hahamon b'meshei ra'amashaya. Disgusting, he says, is a waste of speech. Meaningless talk. Indulging in Hebrew you call it patpetet, and just schmoozing about something from which you can the absolutely non-constructive information. Now, I would say, you asked me, that's why I'm not Maimonides, I guess. If you'd asked me, like, what do you think about neutral speech? What's neutral speech? What's going on, and who did what, and what's new in the news, and and they're going to have a government, not going to have a government. Did they build this building over there or not building? Stop! You're sitting around and shooting the breeze. Says Maimonides, shooting the breeze is revolting. It's not constructive. God gave us the right to speak and the ability to speak, and he endowed us with this thing that he created to communicate with the world and to create the world, and we use it stam. We use it just to, talk about nothing. That's as bad. That might be as bad as abusing language. Apparently there are things that are binary. If it's not constructive, shut up. If it's just shooting the breeze, lo matzati la'ishtav mishtika. I think silence is better. Because you're better off spending your time with things that are, from which you can learn something. You can tell a story if you learn something from it. You can share information if it's constructive. But if it's neutral, if it adds nothing to a person, to his soul, his intelligence, you don't learn a lesson from it in terms of personal discipline, or prevent you from rebelling against or rejecting something which is good, be quiet. Now, that's part of, some of you may be familiar with, I hope you're all familiar with the great Hebrew writer Shai Agnon. Shai Agnon has a famous little book, famous story, which is taught in the, excuse me, certainly in the religious schools either in junior high school or high school, called about a woman named Tehillah. The thing about Tehillah was she was a very pious woman, and she would be quiet. Why would she be quiet? Because according to Agnon, because of course she believed, according to Agnon, everybody's given a certain number of words in their lives, and if they use up all their words, they won't be able to speak anymore, or if I remember correctly, they'll even die. There's a very, very potent way of expressing exactly what Maimonides is saying. What's number 4? Number 4 is fuahuv. As opposed to just shooting the breeze and doing nothing constructive, there's a use of language which is not necessarily involved in teaching Torah or prayer or anything like that, but rather it's still a beloved use of language, which is hu hadibur b'shevach hama'alot ha'sechliyot v'amidatiyot u'bignut ha'pchitut mishnei haminim gam yachad. Using language to praise, to advance morals, good values, and to show or to condemn or to upend their opposites. But that's clearly. You're using language to be able to make a moral lesson. That's really the flip side. Number 5, says Maimonides, the last one, that while shooting the breeze and just stop talking is a waste, and that's disgusting, that's revolting. He says, "Hua mutar," and there is a form of speech which is perfectly legitimate, perfectly allowed. Hua dibur b'meshem yuchad la'adam, things which are of concern to us. We don't live in a synagogue. We don't live in a yeshiva. We live in the world. And there is no reason. Maimonides was absolutely against withdrawing from the world. He would not have believed in joining a monastery where they don't talk. You live in the world. You make a living. You have a practice. You're a lawyer. You're a doctor. You have a business. You have to talk about what you need to be able to make a living or to be able to live in this world. That's legitimate because that's constructive. It's interesting. Maimonides, even when he discusses, excuse me, in the laws of moral values in Hilchot Deot, where he discusses how one should how much one should eat, how much one should sleep, and how much you should enjoy the world. Maimonides always says you should dedicate every single thing that you do to God, but also to the sustenance of your physical substance, because living in the world is a Jewish value. Just don't overdo it. The same thing over here. There is no reason to withdraw from the world because I can't talk because I might end up sinning. No. On the contrary, you have to live in the world, and you're allowed, more than allowed, to speak about, to convey information and receive information that's necessary for you to be able to live. He says, for example, things which relate to scharato, his business, parnasato, his making a living, ma'achalo. You can talk about the quality of the tomatoes. It's okay. Umishteo, what you drink and what you eat and what you wear, all of that is fine. Whatever you want to speak, speak, but you do it out of a realization that you do it as much as necessary. Even there, respect what language is and prioritize what you should be using. What you should be using your intelligence and your God-given capacity for self-expression for, and how, and in what modality. Obviously, you could put a few of these cases together, and you could take the same discussion regarding, the state of the stock market, and it could be number 5, or it could be number 3. That's up to you. That's where free will comes in. So, if that's the case, I would offer that when Reb Shimon Gamaliel, he was a Shimon ben Gamaliel at the time, before he got the job as head of the Pharisees. When he says, I always lived among the sages and never found anything better than silence, could also be interpreted to mean not that you should always be silent, but rather think before you speak. Consider before you speak. It's the opposite of the world of social media, but it's a far more godly and it's a vision of the use of language, which is, while integrated in the world, far closer to that which the rabbis, which the Torah itself advocates, than anything else. It's an interesting ideal for which to aspire. Okay, that's it for today. We will see you, please God, next week, and we will continue with this discussion by Rabban Shimon Gamaliel. Bye.